There are a lot of factors that went into the Cardinals' decision to move Willson Contreras to first base, but what's some of the fallout for other players on the roster like Alec Burleson and Luken Baker? Let's talk about it. What's going on, everyone, and welcome into this edition of b-schaeff Daily. Brenden Schaeffer with you. It is the 13th of November on a Wednesday, talking some Cardinals baseball. The big news was dropping with frequency last week, and then we had the weekend. I sort of lost my voice at the football game and needed to rest it for the first couple days of this week so that I could do my radio show. But now we're back, and I want to talk a little bit more about some of the stuff that happened last week and the fallout from the Willson Contreras news that he's moving to first base. He's going to split time between first base and DH next year, and that's one of the ways the Cardinals are going to be able to keep him on the roster rather than trade him. Right? He had the no-trade clause. John Mozeliak had conversations with all the players who did, and Contreras wanted to stay. Reportedly, it's been reported by a couple of different outlets that, per their sources, also wanting to stay is Sonny Gray. So we believe that's going to be the case as well, more likely than not. And then, of course, you wonder about Nolan Arenado because he was the obvious name that has not been publicly reported to want to stay. And it seems as though the Cardinals are going to take some offers on him. They're going to reach out to teams and see, what the list of teams could be. And then because he's got that no-trade clause, they're going to have to go back to Nolan Arenado and say, hey, what do you think of these options here? I think that's probably the way that it's going to go. And we'll see if he ends up getting moved. I don't think the Cardinals are just going to give him away, but I also think if it's a fair trade and they're able to reduce payroll even that much further by moving him and, get a young player or two that they like and think can help them into the future at some point, then I think the Cardinals are going to be more than interested in making that happen. And of course, if Arenado, if it's even maybe a little bit of a step further than, he'd be willing to listen to destinations and he actively wants to be out of St. Louis, then I think the Cardinals are going to do everything in their power to oblige that. But we'll see. We don't really know. We haven't really heard from Arenado, and because of that, it's kind of hard to speculate. But it does seem, logically speaking, and we've talked about this already, you can go back on the YouTube channel and check out that episode, that Arenado would probably not mind going somewhere else, and I do predict that he will be somewhere else when the Cardinals open play in 2025. But let's talk about the fallout from the Contreras move to first as it pertains to the rest of the roster. In particular, some of the guys that you thought prior to this announcement would maybe be getting a boost in opportunity, especially when it comes to opportunity at first base. It honestly kind of surprised me how many comments I got on the video talking about Contreras moving to first and how I honestly didn't mind it. The only thing I don't love about it is if Willson Contreras doesn't love it and he's just putting on a good face and is going to be willing to play ball because it's what's best for the team. I don't love that for Willson Contreras because I realize how much pride he's taken in turning himself into a really fine defensive catcher, and there's pride that comes with playing that position and being a good hitter at the same time. And I feel like he has just gotten such a bad rap, an unfair reputation across baseball for just things that are outside of his control or maybe weren't even his fault. Maybe some of the stuff has been, stuff he could have done differently, but largely I just think Willson Contreras, I kind of feel bad that it just seems every time there's a story revolving around this guy, people take Narrative Street and just are off to the races with some of this stuff, and it just doesn't really seem fair to the man. So that's the only part of it I don't love. But from a baseball roster building perspective, I said I understood it. It made sense to me what the Cardinals are looking to do. And I didn't agree with the Buster Olney tweet where he said the contract was a mistake and the Cardinals, this and that. Look, they're paying him $18.5 million to play first base. He outproduced offensively Paul Goldschmidt each of the last two seasons, and he's making less than Goldschmidt made. So I really don't see the big issue with it from that standpoint. Talked a lot about how Ivan Herrera and Pedro Pajes play into this because the Cardinals like them both. But I was surprised by the number of comments I got asking about Luken Baker. That was one of the top complaints that I saw from Cardinals fans in the direction of the team for making this move. Why would they move Willson Contreras to first base when they've got a first base logjam with guys like Alec Burleson, Luken Baker? To me, that is a total myth that they have a logjam at first base. I just don't see it. First of all, Paul Goldschmidt started, I got the numbers written down here in my notes, but it's something like 130 some odd games, maybe even more than that, 140 something games at first base last season. So for anybody that says, well, there's a logjam with Goldie gone, I'm not going to subscribe to that. There is theoretically a number of players that could fill the role, but we haven't seen any of them do it. We haven't seen Alec Burleson play first base defense for a full season and hit for a full season. I'm not worried about his bat so much. I've got the numbers pulled up here. Burleson had a fine offensive year. It was a little bit front-weighted where he was better during the first half, slowed down in the second half. But if you told me that, Alec Burleson's going to be pretty close to an everyday player next year, I would say that's right. That's reasonable. He had a 735 OPS, so it trailed off at the end. But a 104 OPS plus. He was 4% above league average based on that. He was fine. Solid, and I think could continue to improve. He's only 25 years old going into his age 26 season. He'll turn 26, in fact, just a couple of weeks from now. But by no means do I think Alec Burleson has to be done improving on his big league career just because he's about to turn 26. But when you think about Luken Baker, and I'm not even saying that we've seen the best of Luken Baker yet, right? Because he hasn't really gotten very much big league opportunity. You can at least say with Burleson, he's gotten a couple seasons worth of pretty moderate opportunity. 2023, he had 347 plate appearances. This past year, he had 595. That's a full season from Alec Burleson, and he showed over a full season he's a major league hitter. 735 OPS. I know that doesn't really jump off the page, but that's quality. That's solid. Right now, if you pair that with below average defense, wherever he plays in the field, that's not necessarily going to make him as valuable of a player, but just from a bat perspective, Alec Burleson, I think, is very much a solid league average to above average hitter, and I think he'll continue to improve in that regard. If you gave me the over-under on his OPS for next year and said he was going to get 500-something plate appearances again and said the over-under was 735, which is where it just was, I would take the over. I would say he would improve upon that because I think his first full big league season, you wear down a little bit in the second half, becomes a little bit more difficult to adjust day-to-day to pitchers. So I feel like Alec Burleson's going to make that adjustment the next time, and I would even probably take over 750 on the OPS for Burleson in 2025. I think he's a solid hitter and the type of left-handed bat that you don't necessarily mind being in there every day, even if he's not performing against left on left, which was true of a lot of the Cardinals lefties last year. He doesn't strike out. Only 76 strikeouts for Alec Burleson all season. And again, he had nearly 600 plate appearances. So that's a feather in his cap to be sure. I am pro Alec Burleson getting an opportunity this year. And you might say, well, how could you say that when you were maybe not, I'm not in favor of the Contreras move to first, but I was able to explain it from the Cardinals' perspective and say, I get it. I wasn't stumping for it. It wasn't something that I anticipated necessarily. It kind of felt like it came a little bit out of the blue, but when you sit down and you look at what it means for the roster and the direction they could look to be going, I thought it made just fine sense. The only part I wouldn't like, as I said, is if Contreras is just putting on a face. He doesn't like it himself, but I would feel kind of bad for the guy. But that's how good of a teammate he is, right? Now, I did see some different people on Twitter were screenshotting his Instagram replies or his likes, and kind of the implication was, that maybe he's not 100% thrilled with no longer getting to be a catcher, but it was nothing derogatory or inflammatory, and I wouldn't blame him if he felt a certain way about it from a personal perspective. But again, he's not out there bashing the team. He's not doing any of that. He is a consummate professional and a consummate teammate. So I'm pro Willson Contreras in that regard. And like I said, I think that would be the only reason I would have a little bit of reservation is like, well, are you pissing off a player that you've already kind of thrown under the bus in various ways? But other than that, I did understand it, and here's why. And that's kind of going to be what we're getting into in this episode as we go along here. Alec Burleson, there will be some outfield opportunity, I think, for Alec Burleson in 2025. You look at it from just a blank slate perspective, corner outfielders are going to be Lars Nootbaar and Jordan Walker. Probably Newton left, Walker and right. Okay? And that's, again, this is all going to be on paper, but that doesn't mean those guys are going to start 162 games. It never goes that way. It will be inevitable that one or two or more outfielders will be injured over the course of the season. So it's not difficult, even if there are no injuries. Let's say there aren't, and both Nootbaar and Walker are performing well. Well, A, that's a good problem to have, but B, they're not going to play every single day, and they're not going to play defensively every single day. Right? Sometimes you might have a Walker DH situation, maybe even Nootbaar a handful of times throughout the year to get him off his feet. Probably not, because he's going to be their better corner outfielder in terms of defense. So they'll probably have Nootbaar out there just about every time he plays, but maybe a couple of times he could DH. But those guys are probably starting, let's say a full healthy season, Nootbaar's going to start 140 times in the outfield, 150 at most. Again, we have not seen a fully healthy season from Nootbaar. It's always, there's going to be an IL stint. If you ask me over, under, 0.5 IL stints, I would say over, but you're hoping it's going to be a short one that just lasts a couple of weeks. But that's just the nature of the game. And Nootbaar plays the game hard. So inevitably, minor injuries are going to happen. Hopefully nothing serious happens to anybody on the team, but we're just being realistic to say, all right, he's probably going to start 130, 140 games, and that's maybe even being a little bit generous. Walker, I could see DHing more than Nootbaar. So if he's going to play in 145 games, and look, I think they'll hide him in some split situations, although he was kind of the opposite of the splits that you expected. So maybe they don't. Maybe he's hitting well and they want to play him every day. That'd be great. They're still going to get him off his feet 20, 25 times, maybe more, if the defense is not what you want it to be. So right there, you can find some starts for Alec Burleson in the corner, and you're going to be able to get him some opportunity at first base too, because it's not going to be Willson Contreras starting 162 games at first. He's going to DH, I think, a lot. And it also does kind of line up from a splits perspective. Luken Baker we'll get into as to kind of how this is going to impact him. But for me, I just wanted to say it off the top that if you think there's a logjam at first, listen to this closely, because I want to explain the entire thing on what you might not be realizing when it comes to the Contreras to first situation. But it won't do any good if you just comment angrily about Luken Baker again and don't listen to the explanation here. All right, so my stance on this, and I consider myself to be in favor of Luken Baker and what I think his role on the 2025 team could be. But I would say don't put him on a pedestal for like he's got to be the guy that gets playing time. And that's why the Cardinals moving Contreras to first is a mistake, because inherently what you'd be doing at that point is putting Luken Baker on the playing time pedestal above Ivan Herrera. And to me, it makes no sense to do that. And the Cardinals are not going to do that. This won't be like the most popular take for people who are all about Luken Baker, which, like I said, I'm a fan of his. But I would say that as we sit here right now, it is my belief that Luken Baker is not necessarily 100% guaranteed to even be in the organization 3 weeks from now or a month from now. I'm going to compare him to, and this is not me saying the Cardinals are going to cut Luken Baker or trade him, but let me compare him to Patrick Wisdom from a number of years ago. It was like 5, 6, 7 years ago at the winter meetings, which is early December, which I am making an effort to try to get to. And again, I'm trying to pick up some podcast partnerships and sponsorships for that week. So if I've already had one person reach out to me, and we've got something in the works, which I'm really excited about. If you've got a business or anything you think, hey, could benefit to partner with b-schaeff Daily, by all means, my direct messages on Twitter are wide open at b-schaeffer12. Would love to work something out with folks so that I can then go and bring the coverage, not only for KMOV, but to the podcast here. It'll be well worth the time. So appreciate you guys if you're interested in that, and just go ahead and DM me is really all you got to do for that. But a number of winter meetings ago, the Cardinals traded Patrick Wisdom to clear a 40-man spot because they just didn't think he'd be part of their future. Now, you can make the argument that that was the wrong decision because Wisdom ended up being a pretty solid big leaguer. He eventually caught on with the Cubs. The Cardinals didn't trade him to the Cubs. He went to Texas. I think it was for Drew Robinson. I'm not going to look that up. But my point was he was like 27, 28 years old and hadn't proven much in MLB at that time. And Wisdom did actually have an 882 OPS in 2017 with the Cardinals. So it's like, now we're talking 6, 7 years ago. So maybe the Cardinals should have been more willing to give him a chance. I'm okay with that argument. I'm just pointing it out that like that's how the Cardinals handled a somewhat situation back 6, 7 years ago. And the argument that fans would make about Luken Baker, who is going to be, by the way, 28 years old when opening day arrives this coming season, but Luken Baker doesn't even have what Wisdom did at the time, which is like a crumb of MLB production. He had his cup of coffee down the stretch this past season, had a 175 average with a 686 OPS, and that was about the same amount of at-bats that Wisdom had in 2017, it looks like. So it's like just a cup of coffee. Now, Luken Baker does have good minor league stats, and like I said, I like Luken Baker. I like his power potential. I think he could be a pretty complete hitter, good bat off the bench to take a tough AB. But I think fans touting Luken Baker like he's a top prospect ready to emerge, and he's 28 years old, which doesn't mean, again, that we still haven't seen his best. His best could be yet to come. It probably is. If anybody would give him a big league chance, I think he's going to outproduce 175 batting average and a 686 OPS. But that's what he had in the big leagues last year. That's what we're going off of so far. I do think he's probably better than that, but he's not part of the equation and hasn't necessarily demonstrated to where you should say, well, we can't move Willson to first and block Luken Baker. To me, that's not a thing. If the Cardinals don't cut Baker or trade him, like again, they could non-tender him if they want a 40-man roster spot. Right now, there are plenty of 40-man spots, so it wouldn't make sense to me to have them do that. But I'm just saying it feels like a non-0% chance until somebody comes out and says, no, they're keeping him and they're excited about him, which I would be celebrating that. I think that's right. I think he has a role on this team that makes a lot of sense and they should keep him. That's my opinion. They should keep him. So again, don't paint this as Brenden hates Luken Baker. That's not it. But here's what I would maybe predict for how the Cardinals would want to handle Luken Baker in 2025 if he's still in the organization. I think the bench role for him as the right-handed version of what Matt Carpenter just was is more than reasonable for his the playing time and the opportunity that would make sense for where Luken Baker is. 2024 Carpenter is a much better comparison for Luken Baker than 2024 Paul Goldschmidt in terms of the role that the Cardinals should be setting aside for him. Because Luken Baker going to be 28 years old, hasn't played in the big leagues, has good minor league numbers, but and has hit a bunch of home runs for sure. But, just 2024, he had an 880 OPS. Very good. 2023 in Memphis, he was really, really good. 1159 OPS. I mean, that would have been the time where you go, all right, he's seen the ball well, bring him up. And look, do I think he could be a Burleson, a 735 OPS or better in the big leagues like Burley just was? Yeah, I think he could do that for sure. I think the Cardinals should keep him. Like I said, I don't think you have to move mountains or avoid moving the mountains in the direction that you want them to in the case of the Contreras thing because of Luken Baker. Now, as far as Burleson goes, you obviously can make a case for him to be on the other side of a first base platoon as the lefty complementing a righty. I just don't think the complement has to be Baker, just like Carpenter wasn't really platooning with Goldie last year. Carpenter was a bat off the bench. Baker can be a bat off the bench. It's just that he'll be facing those tough left-handed relievers in the 7th or 8th inning instead of a tough right-handed reliever like Carpenter would have done. But the role, I think the amount of playing time could be rather similar. Let me kind of break down the way that some of this could work and why having somebody with a track record like Contreras offensively, I think, and again, first base is a position that you want to provide production at. You don't want to just kind of throw that away. And it's not to say that Burleson and Baker splitting it 50-50 would be throwing it away. I just think if you've got Contreras and he wants to be here anyway, and you don't feel like the trade value is such that, and again, because I think the narrative around Contreras throughout baseball is very twisted. So I don't know what the Cardinals would be really getting out of a trade other than dumping some of the salary. Teams would probably still say on Contreras, you got to eat some money. And he's the Cardinals' best hitter. So having him stay, I'm in favor of. But I would say Contreras can play first base on the days where Herrera catches. And when Pedro Pajes catches, you'll have some examples of Herrera DHing and Willson playing first base. You can have some examples of Willson DHing where Burleson can play first base. That probably happens against right-handed starting pitchers. And if the other team has a left-handed starter, okay, that's probably one of the days where you might have Pajes catch, and then Herrera DH, Contreras can play first. Sometimes that could be Herrera catching. Luken Baker, there's a chance for him to play some first base. Willson can still be in the lineup at the DH spot. So I would say open your mind and see that there are lots of combos here, depending on matchups and depending on who's a hot hitter recently, which could include Luken Baker, where I think a lot of these guys could see playing time. And it's just not going to be the same every single game like it was last year. Goldie started, 148 games at first is what Goldie started last year, according to my notes here. Nobody in 2025 on the Cardinals is going to do that. So it will open up those opportunities for a number of guys. And I'm not sure exactly where I'd set the over-under because I think it'll depend on how much Contreras can become a viable defender at first base. I'd say the better he looks defensively, the more games the Cardinals would be comfortable with him starting there. But the same is probably true for Burleson and Luken Baker as well. That's his position, but how good is he defensively at the big league level? Can he handle the rigors? We haven't seen that from any of the three of these guys, just doing it for even close to a full season. None of them are going to be as good defensively as Goldie either. So we're going to be watching that growth play out for whoever's over there, and it's just going to be part of the equation. The Cardinals are going to have to bake that in. Be some more errors made at first base, and that's just it's not going to be that guy's fault either. Again, you have to take the good with the bad. If you're saying that Willson Contreras is going to be the starter at first base, okay, when Willson Contreras maybe makes some errors over there, or Burleson makes some errors over there, understand that was what you signed up for, right? Like, they're not going to just suddenly turn into Gold Glove caliber defenders and be the scoop shovel that Goldie was always at first base. But let's say that Willson starts 80 games at first, and DH is another 50. That would be 130 starts, which is more starts than Willson Contreras has ever had in his career in a single season, ever. So right off the bat, if this plays out, he's starting 68 fewer games than Goldie did at first base last year, which is leaving the 82 games for somebody else on the roster to play first base. Because I said, 80 games for Willson at first. So that's Burley and Baker for the most part. Donovan, I guess you could plug in and, whatever you got to do. But 82 games, according to this breakdown. You're already getting more starts from Willson than you ever did, including both of the last 2 years, which obviously injury was baked into that. But the Cardinals are able to get Contreras' bat in the lineup, which has statistically been the best on the team for 2 years in a row, highest OPS both years he's been here. So he's in there now more than he's ever been in a season in his life, not just with the Cardinals, but with those Cubs years. I think the most he ever started with the Cubs was 123 starts in a season. And I think it's possible to get him there or beyond that now because of the new split for him positionally. Catcher is more demanding. He'll be healthier in theory and stronger to be in the lineup more days, and he'll probably be taking on more DH opportunities even than he did in the past. But still only maybe 50 if he's starting half the games at first. So then let's move over to Burleson. If he defends well enough where they trust him at first base and hits, obviously the bat's going to always play into this for a lot of these guys. I trust Contreras is just going to be in there, but some of the others you'll be like, all right, he's a little colder, maybe, reduce his playing time. But as long as Burley's hitting well, okay, yeah, Walker in right, Newton left. You got to figure out the Brenden Donovan thing, but it's also possible that Donovan just plays a lot more infield than outfield next year. The most obvious way for that to work out would be you trade Arenado, which moves either Gorman or Donovan to third every day. And I'm not even going to get into the debate of who it should be. It really doesn't matter to me for the purposes of this discussion. We're just mostly talking about playing time and offense and lineup stuff more than what's the best defensive alignment. But one of them can play third, one can play second. And so JC would be your backup at both spots and the backup at shortstop. So I think the bench, I've said this going back into the summer, I think the bench has a chance, if the Cardinals play their cards right, to make a lot more sense next year than it necessarily did this year when we were constantly complaining about the makeup of the bench. But now suddenly you can see how the notion of a logjam really anywhere is imaginary. It's all fixed. Burleson is your third corner outfielder behind Walker and Nootbaar. And again, Walker and Nootbaar are not playing 160 games, so perfectly fine for Burleson to fit in there. Ciani and right now Victor Scott are probably who's battling out in center field. I understand that it's not ideal that they're the same side of a platoon, but it is what it is. Maybe you trade one and they add a right-handed hitting center fielder. Maybe Nootbaar plays some center field throughout the year if there's injuries or they trust him or whatever. But as the third corner outfielder, let's find some playing time for Burleson. He can start 20 times for Walker, and that'll be against tough righties maybe. So Nootbaar and Burleson would be your left-handed hitting corner outfielders against those right-handed pitchers in the games that comes up. And it's easy to see why Burley or Newt or the left-handed hitting center fielder would sit if they want to move Newt into center. When they face a good left-handed starter, that would be a day. It's not like you're hiding from it, but yeah, you're going to manage the rest days based on the platoon splits anyway. That just makes sense. I know people think maybe they look too much at the splits, but everybody's going to get rest days, and so you're going to correlate those rest days with when it's maybe not as good of a matchup for the player. All right, so let's say Burleson starts out of the 82 available starts left at first base. He can start, I would say as many as 60 of them, and that's all largely against when there's right-handed pitching in there. He's a lefty who may struggle with lefties, so now he's up to, 20 starts in the corner outfield, which is probably not as many as it will be. Might even be higher than that, but already we got him 80 starts, and we haven't even baked in the DH spot. Contreras, I said, gets 50 of those. This is probably too many, but let's give 50 of them to Burleson. It looks like he got into a game as a DH last year, 60 games, but didn't start in all of them, I don't think. I can't find how many of those might have been starts at DH. Let's just be more conservative. I don't like the 50 number. 30 Burley starts at DH. Okay? Because I just feel like we're going to want the flexibility to put Walker there a little bit. When I say we, me making this blueprint right now. So because I gave 50 to Contreras, let's say 30 to Burleson. That still leaves half a season of DH starts that can be divvied up between, Herrera, can be divvied up for Walker, can be divvied up for whoever may need him. So what have we done for Burleson? 30 at DH, 60 at first base, 20 in the outfield. That is already 110 starts. And again, injuries are going to happen. Maybe he's going to be on a hot streak. Maybe it's 30. Maybe it's 40 in the outfield based on some of that. Suddenly you're already at 120, 130 starts for Burleson, which is plenty. Because, there are going to be some lefty matchups that you'd rather prioritize the platoon. I don't see the problem whatsoever with finding that for Burleson. And remember, I still left 20 starts for Luken Baker at first because I said 80 for Willson, 60 for Burley. That's 22 for Luken Baker. And he can probably have another 10 or 20 of those DH starts that we left open on the table. And then, like I said, Herrera, who else is in the lineup, will make it kind of fill itself out. But you've got enough DH starts to go around now. And with no Goldie, and again, no Arenado as part of this, which is my expectation. And those guys are veterans who would gobble up some of those, not many, but at least a handful of, they're a veteran player. Let's get them off their feet defensively and be strategic about when we do that. So now that factor is gone, and the guys that remain presumably wouldn't need quite as much of that. Now, I think, they'll still want to do it to an extent, but I don't think it will be as much of a priority for the guys that remain. It'll be more about maybe the quality of their defense and who you're trying to put out there defensively to give you the best chance on a given day. But anyway, I do realize a lot of this hinges on the Arenado thing, him being traded. But again, more and more to me, that does seem to be what's coming. And in the world where I found Baker more at bats than Matt Carpenter had last year in that same role, a few DH starts, a few at first, a pinch hit every now and again, really a pinch hit every single night if the matchup presents, I think that's plenty for Luken Baker. This idea that we have to, criticize the Cardinals because they're not allowing enough for Luken Baker. As much as I like Baker, and I would advocate for him to be in that Carpenter role and maybe even get a little more opportunity, 10 to 20% more than Carp got last year in that same role, just reversing the platoon split side of it, I would say that Cardinals fans they're too worried about what's going to happen to Luken Baker. Nothing. He might get to be a big leaguer for the first time in his career for a full summer. That might be what happens to him, and that would be plenty. And it's good depth to have, right? What if Willson goes down? What if Burley goes down? All right, now Luken Baker's going to get more of an opportunity, perhaps. They could shift Donovan to first, whatever. Morris to JC in the middle infield or the left side. Those things could end up playing out instead. But yeah, that's, to me, that's cool. That's my thesis of the whole thing is Luken Baker's going to be just fine if the Cardinals decide they want to incorporate him. I think he'll have his opportunity. This just boils down to me that rather than Baker being the guy that you're rearranging your roster to make sure he's got playing time, Ivan Herrera is that player. He's a former, highly ranked prospect, and he's actually hit in the big leagues. Granted, Baker's never had the chance that Herrera had this past summer, but it was 250 plate appearances that he had an 800 OPS, Ivan Herrera. That's really good. That's Willson Contreras territory. So that's it. I think it all boils down to Ivan Herrera needs the opportunity. He's the guy that they have to clear a path for. Does he have to have an offseason where defensively he makes improvements? 100%. But I would guess that that's where the focus is going to be for Ivan Herrera, largely. The Cardinals have always even kind of tongue-in-cheek been yeah, he really likes to hit. But you could kind of sense would be nicer. They would like him to not have to be told, just individually make defense your priority. Make that your go-to thing to improve this offseason. I think that's kind of what they nudged him toward a year ago, and he came to winter warm-up and said, I learned a lot from last year. And I think he did. I think the one thing that really defensively he's still lagging in is throwing out base runners, but the Cardinals need to have a whole clinic on that at spring training, and maybe it's not that they didn't spend time on it, but clearly it was a deficit for the team last year. So they have to, from a pitching perspective, do a better job of putting those catchers in a better position to throw guys out. Because it didn't matter if it was Pages or Herrera, they were both struggling last year. And I think Pages has a fine arm. I think he handles that decently well. And Contreras, did a great job of it last year. He's got the strongest arm of the three. And so, yeah, it is a little bit of a bummer from that standpoint that you're going to take him and move him out of the position, and that arm is going to be wasted at first base. And I get the frustration with that. But I also think it it's possible for Ivan Herrera to focus on increasing that arm strength and do it over the course of an offseason where you're not trying to do it during the year. That would be difficult. But I imagine when we talk to Ivan Herrera in 2 months at winter warmup, he's going to say, yeah, a lot of this offseason I spent on conditioning and strengthening the arm. And I'm going to be confident out there throwing guys out in the run game, because that's what the Cardinals need from him, to trust him with half or more of the catcher starts, which I think is what's going to happen. Him and Pages are going to get 80 apiece, and that ledger will slide in one direction or another based on who looks better defensively, probably. Because even if the answer is Pages over Herrera, you can still play Herrera now based on the Contreras move by playing him at DH. And I've talked about, I don't think the Cardinals need to worry about not having enough catchers, because you're going to have the best emergency catcher in the history of Major League Baseball. It no longer is there's 3 catchers on the bench. No, I mean, you can put them all in the lineup every single day. One of them gets hurt mid-game. You're like, well, shoot, now what do we do? Well, no, you can move Contreras back there in a pinch. It's not like he's a deficit at that point. Again, if you view him more as like he's going to be in break glass in case of emergency, it's a nice weapon to have in your bag that he could easily do it. He's not going to have the scouting reports. That's not going to be where they're focusing his time. But like I said, he'll be the best emergency catcher in the history of Major League Baseball, bar none. You will never find another one. And that'll give Ollie Marmol some roster flexibility to know that, okay, I had a catcher get hurt mid-game, right? The other guy's going to move to catcher if he was DHing or if he was on the bench. Herrera started, he gets hurt. Or Pages started, Herrera's DHing, you kill the DH probably at that point, which I think they would do. I don't think they would put Willson back there. I think they would go as far to not have Willson catch as to keep him at first base and move the DH on a day where that happened in like the 6th or 7th inning, if that makes sense. So like Pages gets hurt, Herrera moves from DH to catch, and you just pinch hit for the pitcher spot the last time through. And it's like, well, why would they go through so many lengths to avoid Contreras catching if they don't think he's, No, I just think it's a fact of they're having him fill a different role. And that's one where if you're not living it and breathing it every single day, they're not going to necessarily look to utilize that. I could be wrong. I'm sure we'll get a full explanation of how they view it, and then we'll get to see it play out. But I think that works perfectly fine, because then if you don't want to move Contreras back to be the backup catcher or whatever, you just call up Jimmy Crooks at that point, and it's fine. Whoever's the Memphis option. So I think this really does work out. I laid the playing time out as evenly as I could think to distribute it, and now that kind of gives you my thought on around the horn what the entire Cardinal lineup is going to be. You've got Herrera and Pages splitting catcher, Willson at first, Gorman, let's say, stays at second, but I could see him moving back to third. I don't really care. We can debate that another day. Willson at short, Donovan at third. If it's not Gorman, he can switch with Gorman if you want. Sajaci, plenty of opportunity to back up all 3 spots on the infield. Donovan will probably still have to play some corner outfield. Like, that's a nice weapon, and they'll be more than glad to use it. But Burleson is generally going to be the first backup there, because I just bestowed a starting spot on the infield to Brenden Donovan, where he may not need to move around as much. That's if Arenado's traded. That I agree. The whole thing hinges on that. But like I said, I'm predicting he will be. If he's not, we'll cross that bridge and tell you what I think is going to happen with playing time. But then you got the corner outfielders, Nootbaar, Walker, the 2 center fielders. Like I said, did they trade one because they're both lefties and they want to diversify? I don't know. We'll see. But I think that's kind of your around the horn. And we talked about DH. Walker will play there some. Willson will get the most DH slots, I think, unless you see just such a great catching performance from Pages day to day that they want to have Herrera pick up most of the DH work. That's certainly a possibility. And you just kind of go from there, filling in on the Burleson and Luken Baker and other guys. Is that a lineup that just is going to be absolutely dynamic? Maybe not, but I don't think it's a terrible lineup. It might not even be a worse offense than last year. Could be better if guys improve individually. And then you do have to figure out the pitching, and we'll see what that looks like. But again, like the path to the Cardinals having a similar season to last year, wouldn't necessarily predict better than 83 wins, but I think the path to similar is realistic. So that's kind of the way I break it down. I'm not trying to bash Luken Baker. If anything, I think he should absolutely be on this bench. An internal option that they finally get a look at. But I think Ivan Herrera is the guy that's why you move Contreras to first, is Ivan Herrera. Those are my thoughts. Tell me yours in the comments below. Appreciate you guys for sticking with me and for listening to all the shows this offseason. And again, Winter meetings around the corner, just a little less than a month away. If you'd like to get involved with the show in a sponsorship or partnership capacity, I'm at b-schaefer12 on Twitter. Shoot me a DM and we will set that up. Thank you guys so much for listening. We'll talk to you next time on B-Schaeff Daily. Peace.